Welcome to you all on behalf of the organizing group from whatever point on the compass you have joined us for this online event. We, the organizing group, call ourselves Anti-Imperialists for Global Justice. My name is Cecil Gutzmore, and I'm honored to be chairing this session. I hope it will suffice for me to say that I've spent most of the last of my 7.5 decades resisting against the system, if I can borrow a phrase from Bob Marley. Our group's key inspiration is the revolutionary praxis of historian and political economist Walter Rodney, who was enough of a threat to the worldwide system of oppression and exploitation for that system to kill him on the 13th of June, 1980. 40 years later, a key objective of ours is critically to promote an understanding of his theoretical and practical work and to contribute to action aimed at the total liberation of oppressed people from that system. Walter Rodney was a Caribbean African. Somewhat of a newfangled word for the system's relationship to his region and mine is imperialist extractivism, and that is the focus of today's session. The title of these, my opening remarks, is From Christopher Columbus to Donald Trump, Imperialist Extractivism in the Caribbean. A crucial contribution to the making of the modern capitalist world economy has been variously, often violently extracted from the Caribbean. Resistance to this came early, was constant, and was determined, and was also often spectacular. Clear examples of the latter are the revolutions in Haiti and in Cuba. The Caribbean was, from first contact, targeted for exploitation by the ever-evolving, always racially structured system of European capitalism imperialism. Our indigenous population, the fruits of their excellent agricultural system, their land, its timber, its gold, its pearls, its diamonds, its location, its sea, its sand, its climate, and a still growing list of other commoditized items all populate the predator's domain. And that is a quite illicit and totally illegal domain. Christopher Columbus came incomparably better equipped in military technological terms than the natives of the Caribbean. He said he cited in them an intelligent people, quick to grasp ideas and instructions, and he took this to mean that they were available for enslavement either in their homeland or in Spain. And he says, what will determine this is as your majesty pleases. So he's talking to the Queen of Spain. At the murderous pleasure of the powerful, later labor power was to be exploited in the Caribbean under slavery, under indenture, and under what passes for freedom. Not the largely alluvial gold of the Greater Antilles, but the pearls dived up from near Trinidad provided the Spaniards in the early 1500s with their first immediately profitable cargo. The native Taino people in parts of Hispaniola were subjected very early to a census by the Spaniards. That census was linked to agricultural extraction. In Hispaniola and elsewhere, the Tainos were grievously exploited via what the Spaniards called the economía. Within 4 years of the Spanish arrival, the Tainos in Hispaniola engaged in hopeless armed resistance to Columbus's forces. The historical records show that Columbus himself, referred to as the Admiral, responded by setting against the Indians a selection of 200 Spanish foot soldiers, 20 men from the cavalry, with many crossbows, muskets, lances, and swords, and another more terrible and frightful weapon against the Indians, besides the horses, was the 20 ferocious greyhounds, which, when released and told at him, in 1 hour tore each of them 100 Indians to pieces. That is a quote from Documents in Caribbean History by Eric Williams. It follows that our regional tradition of resistance is one that was directed very early against the Spaniards, and it matters that it is the Taino people who are in at the start of that resistance and not actually the Maroons, as has been argued actually a decade later than the mid-1490s. This resistance and this early episode of resistance by the Tainos involved both open or conventional warfare and guerrilla warfare. And importantly, it was led by a female cacique. That's a native name for a queen or chieftainess. And her name was Anacauna. This was a woman. And it follows again that this inaugurates the early female dimension of the grand tradition of Caribbean resistance. The population of the Caribbean was larger by several million than is usually asserted. And their survival levels against the Spaniards was notoriously low. Bartholomew de las Casas confirms this even while unforgivably proposing enslaved Africans as the replacement labor force following the Spaniards' awful and speedy genocide of the Indians, improperly so called. Other Europeans genocided the native peoples who escaped the genocide at the hands of the Spaniards. The Kalinago or Caribs of the Lesser Antilles did not outlast the Spaniards because of their allegedly warlike nature or their actual military prowess. They survived because the Spaniards had an unlimited interest in the active possession and exploitation of their actual islands or labor power, though in fact they did do some slave hunting in the Lesser Antilles. Now, it matters that while Spain had prior experience of sugar plantation agriculture using enslaved people in Iberia, this was not initially extensively introduced into the Caribbean. That means that the Caribbean was something of an economic backwater in the earliest period of the Spanish arrival into the region. And it became more of a backwater when the Spaniards began to give priority to the exploitation of the more spectacular gold and silver that were found in the mainland territories, including and especially Mexico and Peru. It was in this context that the Caribbean region acquired the first of its changing modes of strategic importance. It comes to be called the funnel of gold. It was a site of Spanish naval vulnerability because precious metals extracted by Spain from mainland America had no viable alternative route back to Spain other than through the Caribbean Sea. And this meant that other European powers, so-called, from Northern Europe and Northwestern Europe, ruthlessly battened on the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean and is said to have bled Spain white, attacking Spanish galleons as they came out through the Caribbean. In that context, piracy, both semi-official and official, was the order of the day. Now, by the mid-17th century, the Portuguese Brazilians introduced sugar-producing, slave-based expertise into the Caribbean. They did so through the Dutch Guyanese territories, the Guyanas, and it spread up into the Caribbean. And it was this that made the remainder of the Caribbean into the very valuable capitalism transforming place that Eric Williams talks about in Capitalism and Slavery, and there are equivalent books that deal with the rest of Europe. So the sugar revolution came late, and it came after the 1640s and wasn't anything to do with Spain. Spain, in fact, in territories like Cuba, became specifically exploited in terms of sugar and the like after the 1760s. Now, it doesn't really matter where you look. So that if, for example, you look at Haiti, what you see there, one of the things certainly, is hills that have been terribly and are terribly denuded. And that speaks to the extraction of mahogany and other very precious hardwoods that were taken out and are still being taken out of there. Now, little of fundamental structural importance changed in the Caribbean as it continued to be targeted into the 20th and 21st century. Of course, new commodities or products, their agricultural, their mineral, their human labor power, their sexualized bodies have been unearthed and recognized in the region in the 20th and 21st century, US imperialism prowling and growling and pouncing. It wielded its big stick and its Monroe Doctrine with its brutal economic interest masquerading as freedom-loving anti-communist liberalism. Agribusiness, petrochemicals, bauxite, tourism, gambling, and sexually marketed, largely female bodies have become the major object of economic exploitation in the region. And it doesn't matter whether they're colonies or semi-colonies or neo-colonies. And of course, you have Puerto Rico, which has a very strange status because its real status in international law was deprived from it by the US imperialism. And that happened in the moment when the US, believing and stating itself to be manifestly destined, and also managing to present itself as officially anti-colonial, was busy stripping the low-hanging fruits, is what it called them, from the decrepit Spanish Empire and indeed from other empires. And it took Cuba, it took Puerto Rico, and it took the Philippines in that moment. And we mustn't forget that later on, between 1915 and 1934, the Americans invaded and occupied Haiti. And the thing that they did right at the start of that invasion and occupation was to transfer all of the gold that was in Haiti's treasury and place it, never to be returned, into Citibank in New York. It's worth just us remembering that where the sexualized female Caribbean body is concerned, that is something that we really do have to look at. And there's good evidence, relevant evidence from Cuba. it was an American holiday island. And they expected not only sexual services from the 270 brothels and 700 hotels with rent by hour rooms and the 700 bars which existed in Havana in 1958.
Excuse me, Cecil, 1 minute left.
Soon done, I think, yeah. So this holiday island then was organized in part to sell sexual services to Americans. But that's not the only thing that was happening in Cuba. And Fidel Castro tells us in the clear and excellent terms of his that the Cuban Revolution found when it came to power that public utilities, electricity, telephones, and so on, were all owned by US imperialism. He says that the balance of payments between 1950 and 1960 was favorable to the United States to the extent of $1 billion. And he says that's not taking account of the hundreds of millions of dollars that were extracted from the Cuban treasury by corrupt officials of the tyranny and later deposited in American and European banks. And then he says $1 billion in 10 years. This poor, underdeveloped Caribbean country with 600,000 unemployed was contributing greatly to the economic development of the most industrialized country in the world. 21st century capitalism, imperialism, continues its path of extraction. And it's possible to talk about this in terms of a kind of continuum of extractivism. You have places like Venezuela before the Bolivarian Revolution, where it was just extraction, super profits. You have places like Trinidad that are a little bit mature, but same kind of thing. And you have places like Jamaica, which are close to exhaustion, different materials being extracted in and from these places. You have a state of affairs in which when the Europeans first come to extract, what they're doing is taking stuff that starts off being fully owned by us. And then there tends to be a propaganda which says that their arrival is bringing us benefits. There then follows an extraction process which effectively steals our resources and transfers it to their ownership, and frequently leaves us ending up in debt to them, as is going to be the case in the Guyanese situation, which is now building up. It may be that I don't have time to talk about the extent of the destruction of the environment. Our comrade Lloyd will speak to this later, of the environment in Jamaica, which bauxite has wrought in that place. But in the Guyanese case, what we have is a very false scenario in which international capital is going to enrich poor Guyanese, when in fact what they're doing is polluting. And our sister Amanda will tell the whole of the story. Importantly, it matters that if the extractivist process that is now in train in Guyana goes ahead, from the depths that they are extracting oil and gas, if anything goes wrong, and it can and very well might, it will pollute the whole of the Caribbean region. So over the 500 years of European capitalist imperialist extractivism, what has happened is that our region has been impoverished by a process which settles itself as beneficial to us. Thank you.